Okay, hello and good afternoon. Welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined today by Stephen A. Cook, a senior fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and the author of a number of books, including his most recent titled The End of Ambition: America's Past, Present, and Future in the Middle East. Mr. Cook will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. And if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Stephen Cook. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Anaf. It's a great pleasure to be with you. You startled me a little bit when you called me Mr. Cook. I was looking around for my dad, but thank you very much for the kind introduction, and it's a great opportunity to spend some time with you in Middle East Forum this afternoon. What I thought I'd do is just kind of give you some background on where the book came from, and then talk about what the main arguments are of the book before we get into Q&A. For me, Q&A is always the most interesting part of these types of meetings and podcasts and webinars. So let me get to it. All of my books tend to build on each other, and this one, The End of Ambition, is actually based on a chapter that I wrote in my previous book, which is called False Dawn. In that chapter, which is titled in scare quotes, Getting the Middle East Right, I reflect on a time in the spring of 2011 after Hosni Mubarak had fallen in Egypt. I was in Washington, D.C., and I was invited to a meeting at the Brookings Institution to talk about the Middle East post-Arab uprisings. And the tenor of the discussion was among virtually every Middle East analyst in Washington was, now that Zine El Abidine Ben Ali in Tunisia was gone, now that Hosni Mubarak was gone, now that Muammar Gaddafi was gone, and that it seemed at the time to people who were decidedly not in the know that Bashar al-Assad would suffer similar fate, that it was an opportunity for the United States to get the Middle East right. And that moment, I talked about it quite a bit in False Dawn, but it was really the kernel of what became The End of Ambition all these years later. This itch that was happening for the better part of 5 years before I put pen to paper was the question I needed to answer was, how was it that the United States was failing so badly in the Middle East? The record seemed to me at that moment just one failure on top of the other. But as I dug into the topic, it turns out that the United States record in the region has not always been so bad. Between arguably 1945 and the early 1990s, Washington had actually been fairly successful. It wasn't until the mid-1990s when things started going sideways, and in the 2000s when things went decidedly downhill. This was very, very interesting because I think the dominant narrative in the world that I live in Washington, D.C., has been that the United States has always been a failure in the Middle East. And it's particularly among a new generation of policymakers for whom history really only begins on September 11th, 2001. But the question, the intellectual puzzle was, what was the difference between this period between 1945 and the early 1990s and the mid-1990s and essentially up till 2015? But before I get into that, I'm going to talk a lot about, in the next few minutes, about U.S. interests. And I just want to clarify that in the book, I make it clear that, to my mind, that based on the evidence that we have, that the United States really only had three core interests in the Middle East: oil, which I call the prime directive; second, helping to ensure Israeli security; and third, American primacy, to ensure that no single state or combination of states could challenge those other two interests. And between the end of World War II and the end of the Cold War, the U.S. used its power in the Middle East to prevent threats to the free flow of energy, to help stave off threats to Israeli security and to prevent, as I said, a combination of countries from challenging those interests. Notice that I emphasize the word prevent, and I think that's an important part of answering the question, because after the Cold War, Washington sought to use its power in an ambitious effort to transform the region. That is to say, in other words, when the US tried to prevent bad things from happening to its interests, it was successful. But when it sought to make good things happen for the sake of those interests, it failed miserably. And I think the evidence of this is pretty clear, but I'll go through it. And keep in mind that this was a bipartisan affair. This idea of post-Cold War American power to transform the world, not just the Middle East, but the Middle East seemed to be the one part of the world that needed the most help, was a bipartisan affair. Think about the peace process during the 1990s. This was most certainly about making peace between Israelis and Palestinians and, of course, the larger Arab world. But President Clinton and his advisors had a far larger and more ambitious agenda. They believed that if they settled the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, peace would undermine the rationale for the national security states of the Arab world, ushering in a more open, just, and democratic systems in those countries. You know, it was an elegant idea. It probably made a lot of sense at the time, sitting around conference rooms in Washington, D.C., but it also misapprehended the reason for the national security states of the Arab world. Then came, unfortunately, September 11, 2001. And with it, the belief that democracy was an antidote to terrorism. So that if the United States didn't want terrorism or wanted to mitigate the problem of terrorism, it should go out into the world, particularly the Middle East, and promote democracy. There actually wasn't a lot of evidence of this. In the process of researching the book, I spoke to a fair number of policymakers at the time who, in the crisis after the attacks on New York and Washington in 2001, were groping for things to do to meet this challenge beyond just a military response. And they took a hodgepodge of articles and books and ideas that were on their bookshelves and sort of cobbled them together and came up with this idea of, quote unquote, draining the swamp of terrorism by promoting democracy. Then, of course, there was Operation Iraqi Freedom. Now, Iraq was a danger to the world and in many ways, but there was this belief that not only by disarming Iraq, but also making Iraq a democracy, it would change the Middle East. And then, of course, beyond the Bush years, you have President Barack Obama's Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the nuclear deal. Now, it's odd, I think, to some people for me to include the JCPOA in this effort to ambitious effort at transformation, but in many ways, the JCPOA was part of an effort to transform the regional dynamics of the Middle East, so that the United States could ultimately withdraw from it. But nevertheless, the hunch was that by the time the restrictions on Iran's nuclear program would sunset, there would be a different regime in place, or that the regime that was in place would have come to the realization that it would be better for it to share the region with its neighbors. Now, neither the leaders of the Iranian regime nor the leaders of its neighbors were very much interested in sharing the region, but nevertheless, this was an idea that was central to the JCPOA. As I write in the book, these were, and not to mince words, delusional fever dreams. And they led to one failure after another. And if you look back on this era in U.S. Middle East policy, arguably from 1993, when President Clinton was enticed with the idea of pulling countries of the Middle East into the 21st century and coming to an end with President Obama's JCPOA, the U.S. return on investment was zero or even worse. The question is, now, what do we do? What does the United States do? And what I call it in the book is prudential conservatism. Now, this isn't anything fancy. This is nothing other than me sitting around in my office thinking what would sound good to encapture the ideas that I set out in the last chapter of the book. And what it really gets at is, let's operate from a clear-eyed assessment of the world as it is, not the way we would like it to be. And that will help us understand what is important to the United States and where the United States should devote its resources and what issues that it should care about. One of the problems in this era between the mid-1990s and arguably 2015 was that everything and anything was labeled a core interest of the United States. And if everything and anything is so important, really nothing is. And in, again, my time researching the book, in my periodic lectures at the Foreign Service Institute, various conversations with policymakers, people who should know, when you ask them what was important to the United States, you got just a wild, seemingly random set of ideas that people believed were important to the United States. So what should be important to the United States if we're to reset or realign U.S. foreign policy along the lines that I'm suggesting? And some of those things are actually familiar. I think, the prime directive, oil, will remain important. It is true that there is an energy transition that is underway. It's an uncertain one. But even if, as the collection of U.S. intelligence agencies wrote a number of years ago, that they expect the energy transition to gain momentum after 2030, it still will be a very, very long time, if ever, when the global economy can be decarbonized. Not in my lifetime, not in my children's lifetime, not in their grandchildren's lifetime. And that's, as a result, oil will continue to be important, and the stability of the global oil market will continue to be important. And the United States should devote resources to preventing disruptions to the free flow of energy resources from the Gulf and the region more broadly. Second, I think it remains important for the United States to help prevent threats to Israel. But the politics of the U.S.-Israel relationship is changing. And what I suggest in the book is, rather than a series of memorandums of understanding that commits the United States to aid that is subject to whims of political actors, that the United States should enshrine a relationship with Israel through security arrangements, treaties, exchange agreements governing the exchange of technology and defense technology. This, to my mind, seems a much more productive way to go as the politics of the U.S.-Israel relationship is changing, particularly within the Democratic Party. A number of others, I think, are fairly self-evident, continue to pursue counterterrorism strategies. My plea in the book, though, is if only administrations going back to the Obama administration, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, if they read their own counterterrorism strategies, we'd be in much better place in the Middle East than we'd been before. And the last three are, again, one that should be familiar to everyone is non-proliferation, although with a twist. What I suggest here is that, one, it should be clear to everybody that Iran is a nuclear-capable state, and that the incentives for its neighbors, particularly Saudi Arabia, to proliferate are extraordinarily strong. The United States and Saudi Arabia are currently engaged in negotiations for a security pact, plus a variety of other initiatives, one of which includes helping the Saudis with civilian nuclear technology. The Saudis have been resistant to agree to more intrusive inspections. That's because it seems clear that they're watching very carefully what happens across the Gulf and want to reserve for themselves the right to pursue a nuclear program. Now, I'm not suggesting that the United States should turn a blind eye to Saudi proliferation. I still think it's important to try to prevent it from happening, but we should also recognize that it's likely to happen. And at that moment, when the Saudis seem to have made the move to develop nuclear technology or buy it off the shelf, the United States should help them, should actually help them, devote resources to helping develop a stable and secure Saudi nuclear program. And then the last two issues are climate and great power competition. And when it comes to climate, I'm not suggesting that the United States needs to prevent the climate crisis, because the climate crisis causes conflict. There's been a lot of that kind of argumentation in Washington, D.C., and there's really no evidence for it. But what we do know is that in a region that is particularly vulnerable to high heat and water scarcity, the way people adapt to those problems is by moving. And migration is proving to be a very, very significant challenge to the regions around the Middle East, most particularly Europe. We have a natural experiment going back to 2015, when the Germans allowed 1 million Syrians to come into their country. This gave fuel to the rise, or continued rise, of the nationalist right in Germany and elsewhere throughout the European continent. And if the United States remains committed to the idea of a Europe that is free and prosperous and whole, this is something helping the region in terms of its water scarcity problems. In particular, would be one way to help mitigate this problem where migration destabilizes other parts of the world. And then finally, great power competition. And here I explain that while Russia seems particularly malevolent, it really doesn't have much to offer the countries of the Middle East, with the exception of perhaps troll power. And in that, I mean, exposing the gap between American principle and its actual conduct in the world. But that really doesn't get anybody anywhere. The real challenge here is China. And while in the broad abstract, the United States and China share some interest, particularly in the free flow of energy resources out of the region, the Chinese have demonstrated their willingness to not be interested in any global responsibility, cutting separate deals with the Houthis in the Red Sea in order to bog down the United States in the Middle East so it can't devote resources to the Taiwan Strait. So that what the United States really needs to do is to outmaneuver the Chinese in the region. And I think one of the ways in which the Biden administration is actually trying to do that is by negotiating a security pact with Saudi Arabia. But that's also going to require, and I think this is something that's already begun, the United States to be very clear-eyed about not what it can and cannot do in the region. And what it can do is help and take seriously the security concerns of our partners in the region. It cannot change the politics or the societies of the region. And with some effort, it can offer our partners in the region some alternatives to what the Chinese are offering in terms of technology, although there are some things that certainly the United States can't do. Overall, the plea in the book is to drop the idealism of the last 30 years. And maybe actually, in a counterintuitive way, by dropping that idealism, the United States could do some good in the region. Thanks very much. I look forward to your questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Stephen, for that presentation. We have a number of questions pouring in here. I'm going to start with one from MEF's president, Daniel Pipes. He says, "Very well done, Steve. Please comment on the U.S. failure to address the Red Sea trade crisis."
Yeah. First of all, thanks very much, Daniel, and thank you for the kind invitation and the wonderful review. I really appreciate it. Daniel Pipes and I actually go back quite a ways. I think in 1996, I was a SORF research fellow at the Washington Institute, and we were both on a trip to the region, and that's where I first met Daniel Pipes, and he subsequently published me a number of times. I very much appreciate it, and I appreciate participating today. Look, I have been called a warmonger on this issue. I certainly think that the United States should more effectively use its military forces in the Red Sea to force the Red Sea open. I think this kind of tit for tat, ticky-tacky kind of responses to what the Houthis are doing is demonstrating to them and their Iranian patrons that they can, with some effort, continue to have leverage over a major shipping lanes of the region, someplace through which 10 to 12% of world trade goes. I think we need to take a much more, a larger and more effective military action against the Houthis. But I will say that this is not a problem that is just a problem that began last November. First of all, the Houthis were periodically attacking shipping in the Red Sea well before the conflict between Israel and Hamas on October 7th. But that in our efforts, in our sort of ambitious efforts to forge a new relationship with the Iranians through a nuclear program or rejoining a nuclear program, we turned a blind eye to the fact that the Iranians were equipping the Houthis with more and more advanced military equipment, and importantly, giving the Houthis the ability to develop their own capabilities. Last January, I was hanging around, and it was a weekend, and I watched Hassan Nasrallah's speech eulogizing Qasem Soleimani, and he talked very clearly about giving each member, each affiliate of the axis of resistance, how Soleimani's strategy was to give each and every one of them their ability to cause chaos and mayhem through their own military capabilities. And the United States has turned a blind eye to it, and now we're paying a significant price for it.
All right, thank you. Now, to follow up here, we have a question from Florence Gerber, who asks, what is the economic impact on the U.S. economy from the Houthis?
Well, the United States isn't feeling the impact from the Houthis just yet, but our partners in Europe certainly are. It's not quite COVID level, but supply chains are strained. There's more persistent price increases in Europe than there has been in the United States. And all of this kind of converges on the politics of Europe, which is something, as I articulated before, I think we should all be concerned about. Now, it depends on how you interpret the second round of the French elections yesterday or not. But still, I think there is some momentum for the nationalist right in Europe, which I think is some cause, certain elements of it. Certainly, the AfD in Germany is a great cause for concern to Americans and Americans who want to see Europe whole, free, and prosperous. And of course, this invites malevolent activities by the Russians and the Chinese as well. So while we really haven't felt the brunt of these problems, the Europeans certainly have.
All right, thank you. Now I'm going to move on to a question here from David Lazarus, who asks, how do you see the Abraham Accords changing the landscape?
Well, it's super interesting, and one of my hobby horses is to collect how many times people say that Israel is isolated in the region, and that the Abraham Accords have contributed to this conflict. I continue to believe that the Abraham Accords are an important achievement. It was mostly accomplished by Israelis and countries that it had already had fairly significant relations under the table, and the interests of all those countries dictated that they bring them forward and make them quite public. Despite the terrible conflict that's been unfolding in Gaza since Israel and Gaza, I should say, since October 7th, I'll point out that not a single one of the countries of the Abraham Accords have severed diplomatic ties with Israel, although the Bahrainis and the Moroccans don't have ambassadors in Israel. And that the Saudis continue to say, I was in Saudi Arabia in late April, continue to affirm and reinforce their interest in normalizing ties with Israel. It's important also to understand that the Saudis, who have said over and over again, and the foreign minister was quite articulate just the other day in discussing a Palestinian state, that the price that the Saudis are now demanding for normalization was something that was written in Washington. It wasn't necessarily written in Riyadh. That's obviously not something that they are going to trumpet publicly, but they're also very clear that that is how this dynamic has currently unfolded. That's not to suggest that the Saudis don't care, at least symbolically, about the Palestinian issue, but it is striking to me, after everything that has been said, everything that has been viewed, all the misinformation, the disinformation, the accurate information about the terrible conflict since last fall, yet Israel's relations with its Arab partners remains fairly stable.
All right. Now, here's a question from Merdad Konsari, who asks, or starts with, the Iranian leadership intimates to its proxies that it can get away with things given that the US is unwilling to pay the final price for curbing their ambitions. Would you say that this is true? And if so, would you say it's a clear failure on the part of the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly when it comes to things like the Houthis, um, I'm not when I advocate the use of military force against the Houthis, I'm not going back to the days where we sought to transform the region. I'm looking at this clearer and say, what is a global interest of the United States? And that's extremely important for the United States to ensure the functioning of the global economy. And um, you have to look at who sponsors the Houthis and Hezbollah and all these other groups, and it is obviously the Iranians. And it is odd to me that the Iranian vessel that was helping the Houthis direct attacks on merchant shipping in the Red Sea remained on the surface and continues to remain on the surface. And I do think it's a failure of the United States. And I think it's a failure of imagination on the part of the United States. Everybody in Washington seemed, with the exception of a small few, seem to convince themselves that the Iranians are interested in a new relationship with the United States. When in fact, it was actually not that hard to imagine that in fact, they wanted the opposite. They wanted to push the United States out of the region. And the way in which they would do that was sow as much chaos as possible to convince the American people it wasn't worth the price, which there are plenty of people in Washington who make that argument. I think it's a bad argument and only asks for more trouble down the road.
Oh, thank you. Now, this is something you touched in a little bit earlier in your talk here. Now, in the event of the Islamic regime in Iran successfully developing their nuclear capabilities, are the Saudis the only ones in the region with nuclear ambitions that might counter Iran, or do you think there might be other Sunni Arab states that might take an interest in developing their own nuclear capabilities?
Well, I mentioned the Saudis because they're kind of the big enchilada, and they're also the one Arab state that is big enough, has the influence to move things in the region. Egypt is flat on its back under the weight of crushing debt. Iraq has been laid low by a country that is now essentially vassalized by Iran. Syria, the Israelis took care of the Syrian nuclear program. I mean, Egypt, as I said, has a nuclear program, but can't go very far. And of course, there's the Turkish nuclear program, but the Turks aren't interested in playing kind of this. It wants to lead the region, but not necessarily get into a confrontation with the Iranians. So the Saudis are really the most likely candidate for proliferation. And like I said, um, we may not be able to stop them. And I think that the best way to handle it, if we're unable to stop them, is to help ensure that they have a safe, redundant nuclear program that they're able to establish an actual deterrent with the Iranians.
All right, thank you. Now, here's a question from Ben Hayes, who asks, do you believe, and the answer to this question very well may change after the results of the election in November, but he asks, do you believe our partners in the Middle East are more or less likely to cooperate with the US and Israel on diplomatic and military objectives as opposed to 4 years ago?
I take this as a question of, do they prefer working with Donald Trump or do they prefer working with President Biden? And I think, it's very hard to make the argument one way or the other. Donald Trump broke the Carter Doctrine and the Reagan corollary that encouraged the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, even the Israelis to some extent to hedge with America's competitors in the world. President Biden, yet President Trump was much tougher on the Iranians than President Biden, who spent the first 2.5 years in office trying to rope the Iranians back into a nuclear program, which also angered and concerned our partners in the region. But the Abraham Accords at the same time form the basis of this new security architecture that we saw in play in April when the Iranians fired drones and missiles at Israel. And the Israelis got help not just from the United States, the UK, and France, but Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, as well as Jordan. So I think the records of both presidents are actually quite mixed, and there's reason for concern in the Middle East relating to both of them.
All right. Well, thank you. We have unfortunately reached the end of our podcast.
I was just getting warmed up.
Yeah, there's plenty of great questions coming in. I wish we had more time to answer all of them. But in any case, we would like to thank you again, Stephen, for taking the time to join us this week.
It was a great pleasure to be with you. Thanks so much, Anna. And thanks for the terrific questions, folks.
Of course. And is there anywhere where our viewers and listeners can go if they'd like to follow more of your work?
Yeah, they can go to cfr.org and find me there. That's the homepage for the Council on Foreign Relations, or they can follow me on Twitter at Stephen A. Cook.
All right, great. Now, very good. For those watching this recording on YouTube, I'll be sure to put a link to The End of Ambition in the video description, as well as a link to a forthcoming review of the book by MEF's president, Daniel Pipes. And as always, for our viewers and listeners, we thank you all again for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.